It's a very special occasion because we have a very prominent guest who graciously agreed to give a very interesting talk for our graduate students. This person is Professor Gary Steiner. Gary Steiner is a professor of philosophy at Bucknell University. He holds degrees from the Santa Clara University School of Law and the University of California, Berkeley. Also, he has a PhD from Yale University. He's a very prolific author, as many of you know. He has written many books and essays in his fields of expertise, which include modern philosophy, 19th and 20th century philosophy, and of course, the moral status of animals. The topic of Professor Steiner's talk for today will be must a being be rational in order to possess rights? And I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that we are all very intrigued to hear what he has to say. So, on behalf of the administration of the MA Animal Welfare Ethics and the Law, I would like to welcome Professor Steiner and thank him for giving our graduate students and everyone else who's attending the opportunity to hear this very interesting talk. At this point, I would like to ask everyone again to silence your microphones. You will be given the opportunity to ask Professor Steiner questions at the end. I would also like this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel at a later date. So if someone isn't comfortable being on camera, you may turn your cameras off. However, if you would like to ask a question, please turn it back on because it's only aligned for Professor Steiner. That's all from me. Θα ήθελα να σας παρακαλέσω στο τέλος της συνεδρίας οι ερωτήσεις να απευθύνονται μόνο στον καθηγητή Στάινερ. Αυτά από μένα, κύριε Παπαδάκη. Με ακούτε, κύριε Παπαδάκη?
Are you ready for me, Vicky?
Okay.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
We're just waiting for Evangelist to say a few words.
Perfect.
I'm a little bit illiterate in this. Dear colleagues, dear students, I'm glad beyond words to welcome Professor Gary Steiner tonight. This time Gary as an invited speaker, but who knows what the future holds for the times to come in the future. Professor Steiner has earned immense reputation as an expert scholar in the field of Cartesian philosophy and also as a philosopher in the field of animal ethics and especially animal rights. Next to this, he has earned my reputation as a kind, thoughtful, and generous person of the rarest quality and as an excellent friend. I mean this, Professor Steiner. Gary, thank you for being here with us today. Of course, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. It's a delight to be here. I want to first thank Professor Proto-Papadakis for this gracious invitation, and also Ms. Proto-Papadaki for being very, very helpful in making the arrangements very, very simple for me. I was in Athens for my first and only time in 2013, and that's when Professor Proto-Papadakis and I first met one another, and somehow we became very fast friends, as we say in English. And I want to return the very, very kind compliment that Professor Proto-Papadakis offered to me, which is I find him to be a very, very profound kind of person, the kind of person I like to work with in philosophy, because in the United States, philosophy is a little bit too much like pugilism, like fist fighting. And I don't think that we really come to the right kinds of insights in philosophy when it takes the form of a fight. So with that in mind, and that sort of relates to the theme that I'd like to share with you today, the first thing I want to see if I can do is share my screen with you. And let me, let's see. will just take me one moment. And then I need to swap the screen. Here we go. Now, does the slide fill your screen? In other words, do you just see the picture with my name and the title, or do you see other things as well?
We can see, this is Vicky, we can see the slide, but we can also see some gray areas. I don't know if this is part of the slide.
Okay, I not know that it is. What I'll just show you, I'm sorry, terribly sorry, I'm not conversant with WebEx, and so I don't know exactly how this works. As long as you can see the slide and read it, I think everything will be fine. I'll just point out for you students that my email address is there, my web page is there, and you can find information on the books and so forth that I've written. So let me get this started. There we go. All right. Philosophers in the Western philosophical tradition have long taken the view that a being must be able to conceptualize rights in order to be considered a bearer or possessor of rights. Proceeding from this axiom, thinkers in the tradition who conceive of morality in terms of rights argue that it makes little or no sense to attribute rights to non-human animals. Some of these thinkers attempt to confer limited rights on non-human animals. But these thinkers, too, proceed from the tacit and sometimes explicit assumption that human beings are categorically superior to non-human animals. On my view, which I have developed in 3 books devoted to the topic of animal rights, is that thinkers who follow this line of reasoning employ a narrowly anthropocentric conception of reason. By anthropocentric, I mean a global set of value assumptions that attribute absolute superiority to human beings over all other beings in nature. In my own work, I've sought to contrast the anthropocentric worldview with a comparatively non-anthropocentric one that precisely does not start from the assumption of human superiority. The non-anthropocentric worldview that I advocate deems human beings to be endowed with certain cognitive abilities that other beings appear to lack. But the non-anthropocentric worldview does not involve the assumption that specifically human forms of cognition make us superior to other beings. To say that language or rationality, what in your language is called logos, renders human beings superior, to say that logos renders human beings superior is, on the non-anthropocentric view, a little like saying that a car is superior to a bicycle because a car has a steering wheel. A central aim in my work on the moral status of non-human animals has been to unravel or challenge the assumptions that underwrite the anthropocentric worldview, so as to prepare the way for a radical rethinking of the moral status of non-human animals. So in the following remarks, I'll provide an overview of the views of the most influential anthropocentric thinkers. Then I'll present some critical remarks about the assumptions of those anthropocentric thinkers, and I'll conclude with some ideas about how we might cultivate a non-anthropocentric worldview that does true justice to the moral status of non-human animals. So, major exponents of the anthropocentric worldview. The core axiom of anthropocentric thinking is the notion of logos, which, as you know, signified for the ancients both rationality and language. Logos, in this sense, is, as I see it, linguistically structured rationality, which is to say, rationality that involves conceptual abstraction and predication. In fact, thinkers from Aristotle to Kant often proceed as if this were the only possible form of rationality, even though, as I will note at the end of my remarks, there have been thinkers who propose very fruitful conceptions of rationality that do not involve anything like predication. Aristotle is ambivalent in his writings about the rationality of non-human animals. If you've read his zoological writings, which are quite extensive and exhibit a surprising degree of familiarity with diverse forms of animal behavior, you're aware that Aristotle attributes various forms of ingenuity and intelligence to non-human animals. Although at one point he offers the qualification that non-human animals simply behave as if they possessed capacities such as zoonosis. In his ethical and political texts, Aristotle presents a considerably more categorical view about non-human animals. In Book 1 of the Politics, for example, Aristotle excludes non-human animals from political community with human beings, and he does so on the grounds that non-human animals are aloga. On this basis, Aristotle argues that non-human animals exist specifically to satisfy human needs and desires. And he classifies non-human animals as chattel, as living property similar to human slaves. The difference between the two, between animals and slaves, simply being that human slaves can at least follow a rational principle, even if they cannot generate it for themselves. The bottom line for Aristotle is that a being must possess logos in the sense of linguistic rationality in order to count as a member of the moral and political community. And any being that lacks logos may be treated as a tool or instrumentality. The notion of rights enters into the discourse of ancient Greek philosophy, as you know, in the thought of Epicurus, who conceived of the notion of justice in contractual terms. Justice, in its essence, consists in mutual agreements of non-harm. For example, I will not take your belongings except under certain circumstances, such as barter, purchase, gift, etc., provided that you do not take my belongings except under comparable circumstances. The basic notion of fairness that will later inform the writings of the 20th century Harvard philosopher John Rawls is apparent here. If one party to the agreement honors the agreement while the other does not, Epicurean logic indicates that something unfair or unjust has occurred. This Epicurean logic has influenced a great many subsequent thinkers who argue that because non-human animals cannot enter into agreements or contracts, it cannot possibly make sense to say that we owe anything to non-human animals. The apex of this form of thinking is best seen, I believe, in the Stoic philosophers who conclude that non-human animals are categorically excluded from the sphere of right in virtue of lacking rationality. And the Stoics argue that as a consequence, as a result, nothing we do to a non-human animal can possibly be classified as an injustice. In modernity, Kant reinforces the anthropocentric prejudice by drawing a fundamental distinction between beings possessing logos and those lacking it. Kant's elaboration of the ancient notion of logos is most evident in his characterization of rationality in terms of legislative autonomy. In other words, the ability of an agent to recognize and voluntarily subject themselves to the moral law that is dictated by the very nature of rationality. The rational being, in other words, is able to recognize the demands of morality simply by looking inward and reflecting. And the rational being is able, on that basis, to conquer the sorts of inclination or personal drives and tendencies that often lead us to disrespect the moral law, ourselves, and other rational beings. Kant characterizes rational beings as what he calls persons, personen, and non-rational beings as things, or what he calls Sachen. A person on this view is a being. I'm sorry. Some of you have your microphones on. It might help me if you turn them off, please. I'm getting some feedback. Thank you very much. I'll just repeat this because I think there might have been a question. The distinction in Kant is between persons and things. Personen und Sachen. And a person is a being that is autonomous in Kant's specific sense of possessing the ability to legislate and obey the moral law. A being, on Kant's sense, who counts as a person also is able to do science and is able to engage in ethical conduct and so forth. Any being that possesses logos in this sense is a person for Kant. Any being that lacks it is automatically classified as a thing, which means a tool or instrumentality. A person on this view is a being possessing linguistic rationality. This is the capacity that enables persons to address three key questions in life that Kant presents near the end of the Critique of Pure Reason. And you are probably familiar with these questions. What can I know? What ought I to do? And what may I hope for? On Kant's view, only those beings capable of addressing these three questions merit any kind of respect and possess full and direct moral worth. Things, on the other hand, is a category that includes all beings not rational in the specific sense of logos. Things are beings that we may treat as sheer tools or instrumentalities. In other words, beings to which it would be absurd to attribute either direct moral worth or rights. At one point in his writings, and I have to tell you, this was a remarkable discovery when I first read this many years ago. At one point in his writings, Kant suggests that non-human animals, domesticated ones at least, possess the same moral status as fertile fields and crops such as potatoes. At another, he characterizes the human being as the titular lord of nature, which recalls Descartes' suggestion in the 1637 text Discourse on Method that physics will render human beings the masters and possessors of nature. To my mind, it is difficult to articulate a more pointedly anthropocentric commitment than that. The influential 20th century political theorist John Rawls relied on the thought of Aristotle, Epicurus, and Kant in arguing that an individual must be able to conceptualize rights in the abstract in order to be deemed a bearer or possessor of rights. On Rawls's view, if you cannot grasp at the level of rational abstraction what a right in general is, it simply makes no sense to suggest that you could possess a right. On Rawls's view, this categorically excludes non-human animals from the political sphere, or the sphere of right. But Rawls acknowledges that we might still have moral obligations toward non-human animals, even though we have no political relationship with them. To make sense of our moral obligations toward non-human animals, assuming that we actually have any, would require what Rawls calls, and I'm quoting here, a theory of the natural order and our place in it. This is the entirety of Rawls's pronouncements about our moral obligations toward non-human animals. Now, I take the notion of a theory of the natural order and our place in it as a revealing point of departure for rethinking the question of non-human animal rights. In my current work, I discuss this notion of the natural order in terms of what I call background ideals of living. Background ideals of living. A background ideal of living is a global set of commitments and presuppositions that inform our individual insights and judgments. In the context of non-human animal ethics, as I noted at the outset, I contrast anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric background ideals in the hope of drawing out the underlying assumptions of the anthropocentric ideal as a basis for bringing the specific features of a non-anthropocentric ideal into view. And I think this is important because the notion of a non-anthropocentric ideal has not yet been fully thought through. I take the thinking of Aristotle, the Stoic philosophers, Kant, and perhaps even Rawls as exemplary of the anthropocentric value orientation. They all, in one way or another, privilege human beings over all other beings in nature. And this global commitment informs a wide variety of individual judgments about the permissibility of using non-human animals in various ways to satisfy human needs. I do not see a way to argue from within the anthropocentric ideal for the proposition that many non-human animals possess full and direct moral worth, and that we infringe on that worth when we treat non-human animals simply as tools of instrumentalities. I don't think you can argue for that from within the anthropocentric worldview. So I challenge the anthropocentric ideal on the grounds that it conflicts with important aspects of our experience, and on the grounds that it is transparently self-serving. In particular, advocates of the anthropocentric ideal are very quick to assume that we can know which experiential capacities non-human animals do and do not possess. Advocates of that ideal also assume that the experiential capacities that we consider to be uniquely human are the very capacities that render us superior to non-human animals, where the supposed superiority entitles us to use non-human animals as resources. These two assumptions, that we know what non-human animal experience is like, and that human beings uniquely possess capacities that render us superior to the rest of nature, these assumptions stand in need of some very serious questioning, I believe. That questioning is made extremely difficult by the fact that we have become accustomed to several millennia of anthropocentric values. But we're not starting from scratch in the endeavor to rethink the moral status of non-human animals. The very tradition that has been overwhelmingly anthropocentric in its orientation also contains resources for establishing and embracing a non-anthropocentric worldview. A key feature of that worldview, in contrast with the bold self-assertion of the anthropocentric view, will be a clear sense of modesty on the part of human beings. So I will conclude my remarks with a very brief overview of 4 philosophical contributions to the effort to honor the moral worth of non-human animals from a non-anthropocentric standpoint. So in antiquity, Porphyry wrote one of the very few texts devoted entirely to the question of meat eating, the Abstinentia, or on abstinence from killing animals. Of course, one other such text is Plutarch's De Aesu Carnium, or on eating flesh. But I'll focus on Porphyry here, who relies a lot on Plutarch. Quite often you'll find Porphyry telling stories without attributing them to Plutarch, but actually come from Plutarch. In any case, it just tells us that plagiarism is a long and honored tradition. In any case, in De Abstinentia, Porphyry directly challenges the Aristotelian notion of logos, arguing that logos need not be understood solely in terms of linguistic rationality. On Porphyry's view, any being that reckons or successfully comes to grips with the world in a manner that involves subjective awareness is a being possessing logos. It's a much broader conception. And it reminds me of something that Schopenhauer would say in the 19th century in The World as Willing Representation, where Schopenhauer says, I think in the same spirit, that any being that possesses eyes possesses understanding. I consider this a potentially fruitful avenue to pursue, as it is obvious that many non-human animals negotiate their environments quite successfully and I would even add to this as a footnote, I would argue more successfully than human beings in many, many cases. And if we deny any sort of subjective understanding to non-human animals, then we are forced to assume that non-human animals are essentially biological reaction devices driven exclusively by instinct. And that's an assumption that I find wildly implausible. The other three thinkers are all from the much more recent past that I want to talk about briefly. In the case for animal rights, Tom Regan proposed that in addition to Kantian moral agents, we need to make a place for what Regan calls moral patients, beings who are bearers of rights even though they are incapable of taking on any duty. In presenting the notion of the moral patient, Regan was directly challenging the anthropocentric axiom that a being must be capable of logos in the Aristotelian Kantian sense in order to count as a being with direct moral worth. And when you think about moral patience, if you haven't read Regan, very influential book from 1983, when you think about moral patience, intuitively, Regan wants to say, look, little children, adult human beings with cognitive difficulties, they can be considered moral patients. And if that's true, by the argument from marginal cases, why wouldn't we also consider not many sentient non-human animals to be moral patients as well? More recently, the Austrian ethicist Herwig Grimm has proposed the notion of the Tier an sich, or the animal in itself, a very interesting idea by which Grimm means to underscore that we cannot really know exactly what the experience of non-human animals is like. Just as Kant thought that we could not establish knowledge of the thing in itself. Here again, there's a moment of modesty in Grimm's thinking, in acknowledging that non-human animals may possess an extraordinary richness of experience that we human beings are incapable of grasping. So the idea is, if we don't recognize a capacity in a non-human animal, it's been long assumed the deficiency or lack was on the part of the animal. And what more recent thinkers, including Franz de Waal in the United States, have argued is perhaps the deficiency is on our part, not on the part of the animal. Finally, in 2015, the German philosopher Bernhard Taurek published Manifestus Veganen Humanismus, or Manifesto of Vegan Humanism, in which he proposed a new moral imperative to take the place of the Kantian categorical imperative. He called it the Entnutzungsimperativ, or imperative to discontinue use of non-human animals. Taurek's central claim complements Grimm's notion of the Tier an sich, or the animal in itself. The idea is, not only do we not really know what non-human animal experience is like, but in addition, the only way to begin to appreciate the experience of non-human animals is to stop using animals and let them be the beings that they genuinely are. This commitment reminds me of the German philosopher Heidegger's call to let beings be, sein lassen des Seienden. And it strikes me as a sign of the deep modesty that we will need to exhibit if we are ever to honor the moral worth of non-human animals. These are the remarks that I prepared. I just want to make one final remark, and that is Professor Proto-Papadakis has invited me to prepare this with textual references as a paper for publication, and I'll be happy to do that. So if you want to follow up on any of the ideas or references, this should be available before terribly long. With that, I'll stop the screen sharing. And thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have or comments.
Professor Steiner, thank you so much for this very rich and inspiring talk. Unfortunately, there were some gray boxes on the screen which didn't allow everybody to see your citations. But
I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's okay. You probably share your presentation with. You provide the presentation so you could post online and everybody would have access to that.
It's absolutely fine. Yes.
Okay. Before we open the floor for questions, let's extend a warm welcome to Professor Gary Francione, who is also attending the lecture. Good evening, Gary. And if you want it, the first question, of course, goes to Professor Francione. But if not, please feel free to ask Professor Steiner anything. Be brave, everybody. Don't hesitate. May I start with a question myself, Professor Steiner? If we acknowledge in the case, or suppose we acknowledge rights to animals as we do with humans, would they be in an equal standing compared to the ones of humans, or not, in your opinion?
You cut out just a little on me. Can you ask the last part of it? I missed the last bit.
Excuse me, didn't get it.
I didn't hear the entire question.
Yeah, okay. I will repeat it. Suppose one is willing to acknowledge rights to animals as he or she does to humans. Would they be in equal standing given the differences between the species or not? I mean, is there a common ground based on which we should acknowledge equal rights rights of equal, let's say, standing to humans and animals? I mean, is this a sentient basis enough, or something more would be needed to this purpose?
Well, so I'm still on. I heard the question, and I'm not sure I understand it in its entirety. I'll answer the question that I think you asked, and that is this. I think that the person who's done the best job of answering this type of question, if I've understood it correctly, is Professor Francione. He does a very, very lucid job of explaining the difference between equal rights and equal consideration of interests. And I would recommend he's written extensively, as you all know, but the book Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Trial of the Dog, explains this distinction, I think, very, very aptly. So it doesn't mean, and this is Professor Francione's example, I might as well just borrow it from him since I can't come up with a better one. It doesn't mean if animals have rights, it doesn't mean that cats get driver's licenses and dogs get to attend university. And I think that even though I'm not really a big fan of Martha Nussbaum's work, I think that some of what she has done helps to clarify the idea, which is, back in the Republic, when Socrates at one point is talking about justice, he talks about each doing his own, or each having his own, and he never really explains what that means. But to me, that's a very, very inspiring idea, that different types of beings have different capacities for flourishing, and the flourishing of my cat doesn't require driving a car, for instance. I think the real problem is in points where, in areas of life where there are common needs that come into conflict with each other, such as habitat and things like that. That's where I think it's going to be a very, very difficult negotiation for human beings to confront our own selfishness and 2,500 years of treating animals as just things that you put out of the way so that you can build a house. As far as the question of whether sentience is enough, this is a place where my own views have been evolving over the last few years. And while I do believe that sentience is necessary, for full and direct moral status, I think that sentience by itself is actually an underdetermined notion. And I believe that, and this is what I'm about to say is highly controversial, but I believe that there is a way of understanding the notion of autonomy or freedom in non-human animals that is not Kantian. It simply has to do with animals being able to take care of themselves without interference of others. And I think that any being that is sentient has, sentience is not something that just happens where you can experience pleasure and pain or see colors or hear sounds. All of those things are part of an ensemble of experiential capacities that creatures use in order to negotiate, understand, and manipulate their environments. And to me, any being that can do that does not need the interference of human beings. And indeed, I believe that the interference of human beings needs an argument to justify it. I don't know if that answered your question, though, Evangelos.
Can I didn't have my microphone unmuted before, so I tried to ask a question, but I was unsuccessful in doing that. But first of all, hi, Gary. How are you doing?
Hi, Gary. I'm well. How are you?
I'm happier that Donald Trump is no longer president, but he doesn't seem to want to leave, and so I'm continuing to have anxiety about that. But so basically, you're moving towards sort of a preference autonomy. I mean, sort of like Reagan's preference autonomy, because I don't think that Reagan doesn't require sort of a full Kantian autonomy, but he basically talks about preference autonomy. Is that
if you want to, Gary, if you want to talk about it in those terms, that's fine. As you know, since we've known each other for 15 years, I hate academic jargon, and I only use it when I absolutely am pinned in a corner. I've never been comfortable with this language of preference autonomy. And if you want to use it and it helps you to clarify things, I think that's great. I don't tend to use that language. So if you can translate what I said into that, I guess so. But it's not the way I think about it.
But you could surely have, though, beings who really, what was the expression you used before? If they've got the abilities to
understand and manipulate their environment, something like that.
Right. Well, you could have infants who are sentient, but nevertheless not able to manipulate their environments, or you could have people who have extreme mental disability, people who are experiencing advanced memory degeneration and things like that, who live basically second to second to second. Those beings are not able to really manipulate their environments very much. Nevertheless, they are sentient. They're subjectively aware. They exist in the second. So you would think that those beings are not capable of having at least the right not to.
I have no problem with those kinds of beings. And the reason is because I think that, manipulating your environment, the sort of standard or kind of canonical case of that is I pick up a pen and I write with it, something like that, where there's clear physical actions, movement of the body, that kind of thing, to actually exercise dominion over something outside the body. I'm not entirely convinced that is to me, that might be a reductive conception of autonomy or freedom. And to me, an infant can get all kinds of enjoyment out of life, can suckle at the breast, can get the warm blankie on its cheek. It can do all kinds of things that we might not typically think of as manipulation. And I think the same thing is true of a person with a severe cognitive impairment. People in that kind of way of being are able to get all kinds of enjoyment out of life and accomplish all kinds of things that might not satisfy our criteria for accomplishment. But I think that this is in the spirit of Taurek and Grimm. I think we need to be very, very modest and diffident in making assumptions about what does and does not constitute the freedom to take care of yourself, even if your mother needs to take care of you because you're impaired. I just don't have a problem with those kinds of beings, Gary.
Well, but then what beings would be left out then if you just leave it sentience?
Plants and any insensate animals such as oysters, perhaps.
But plants,
bivalves, maybe bivalves.
Okay, Well,
I'm willing to, this goes all the way back to my very first book on animals, Anthropocentrism and its Discontents. The epigram for that book is Hume's remark that to the universe, the life of a man is worth no more than that of an oyster. And, that was kind of the beginning of my thinking about how to understand the lives of non-human animals, with the admitted limitation that we constantly have to draw analogies to our own kinds of experience, even though my concern with Frans de Waal and people like Taurek and Grimm is maybe the categories that we use to conceptualize our own experience are ill-suited to explain or understand the experience of non-human animals, especially those who are cognitively very, very different from us, such as reptiles and avians.
So do you think plants are, when you said plants, you think plants are sentient or arguably sentient?
No, I don't. No, I think that's hogwash.
But then what I'm asking you though is what animals, if you say that your views have evolved from sentience, I'm trying to understand what animals would be excluded if we just use sentience. If we talk about sentience and then we talk about where you've evolved to or where you are now, right. What animals are left out?
This is helpful. Thank you for rephrasing it. So here's what I want to say. Now what Professor Francione is asking is not a philosophical question. He's asking one that involves more reliance on facts. And to expect a philosopher to answer a question that is the specialty of an ethologist is probably not really the best way to go. I would want to get Frans de Waal on the phone and ask him that question. And I would get back to you with the answer, Gary.
Well, but then
I know where the line is to be drawn. My attitude on these things is the ethic of human modesty is one where we confess our own ignorance. Like maybe we can't answer that question. Maybe we don't know where the dividing line is to be drawn. But the fact is, and I think you and I have talked about this before, Gary, the fact that we don't know exactly where the line is to be drawn between sentient and non-sentient doesn't mean that we don't know that cows are sentient. In other words, the dividing line question is a very interesting one, and I don't think that everything else gets held in abeyance until we decide it. That can only be decided later after this Nutzungs imperative or the Taurek imperative to discontinue use is respected. Only then can we get a clearer sense. I don't think that from within the standpoint of 2,500 years of anthropocentric thinking, it's reasonable to expect that we can have lucid answers to these kinds of questions today.
Right,
that's my position.
But then what you risk though is if you say more than sentience is required, then it becomes an empirical question as to whether or not a being has the sentience plus.
I never said that. No. Now you've misunderstood me, Gary. I never said more than sentience is required. Never. I don't believe it, never wrote it, never said it. What I said is sentience never occurs alone. It always occurs as part of an ensemble, a complex ensemble of experiential capacity. That's what I said. So it's not that more than sentience is required. I agree with you that sentience, that's enough. But if you're sentient, you have all these other capacities as well. And I think focusing narrowly on sentience abstracts away from the context in which it's always found. That's my thinking. So maybe we should let some of the students ask questions. What do you think?
Please, everybody, feel free to ask whatever crosses your mind.
Hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask if there is any distinction between domestic animals and wildlife, because the environment is considered to have value of its own, and I guess wildlife is attached to this. Maybe there is a distinction in theory. That's what I would like to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is a sort of vexed, controversial area. I don't claim expertise in it because I'm very confused about it myself. One thinker who has written about this with some clarity is an American named Claire Palmer, and her first name is C-L-A-R-E, last name P-A-L-M-E-R. and I forget the title of the book, but it came out about 10 years ago, and she talks about wild versus domesticated animals. She argues that we have obligations to domesticated animals that we do not have to wild animals. And she has an interesting argument for that conclusion. But given the fact that human action has caused such epic devastation to the environment, there's an argument on the other side that says we now have a relationship with wild animals that requires us to act on their behalf because we've done so much to destroy their environment and habitat. So I personally, and then another text or thinker to be bring in here is Donaldson and Kimlicka's book Zoopolis, in which they make certain kinds of distinctions between animals that they think of in terms of citizenship, liminal status, and foreigners. And there's another classification of beings that are passing through, like migrating geese. So there are a lot of different views about this, and I would simply refer you to thinkers like Claire Palmer and Donaldson and Kimlicka. There's some other thinkers writing about this as well. On my own views, I'm ambivalent about this at this point.
Hello, Professor Steiner and Professor Francione. May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I have to say I'm not a student, I'm an activist, and probably I'm thinking as an activist. So my question is, I feel that as an animal rights movement, instead of focusing on acknowledging other animals' negative rights and their property status, we rely too heavily on treatment and the horrific conditions that they are enduring. Do you feel that the reason for that is that maybe the idea of rights is too abstract for the majority of activists? Is there a miscommunication between academia and activists on the front? And what do you think we could do to change this? Because I'm feeling that as long as we focus on treatment, we're driving non-vegans and people that don't engage with the idea of rights down the welfarist path.
Interesting. This is a great question. I'll elect to go first, but I'll just say I have a feeling that what I'm about to say is different than what Professor Francione will say, although I think our answers are probably compatible with one another. In my own work and in the book that I'm completing this year, I'm focusing a lot on a notion that I wrote about in my second book on animals, the book Animals in the Moral Community. I talk about the notion of felt kinship, felt in the sense of feeling, that's the basis for my notion of the moral communities, kinship, relationship that we feel. And I consider that to be something that is absolutely essential for changing people's values and conduct. I argued this at the end of my most recent book, Animals and the Limits of Postmodernism. In the final 2 pages there, I say, arguments alone are not going to do it, right? Rational arguments are necessary, but they're not sufficient by themselves. What there needs to be is a change of heart. And what I said at the end of Animals and the Limits of Postmodernism was that it requires a kind of shocking experience. You have to be shocked out of your complacency. And for me, that experience, I don't know why, but the experience for me was when I was 15 years old in high school in the United States, I read Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which is about the meat packing industry in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. It was written in 1906. And that horrified me. The description of the treatment of pigs in that. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I wrote a term paper on it, and my literature teacher was very frustrated and wrote in red pen at the end of the paper, I don't think you understood the book. The point of the book is not about animals, it's about humans. And for a long time, I thought I was stupid until I realized that I wasn't. Because what I recognized in that experience, over a long period of time, was that the way that you get people to change their behavior, their values, and their whole way of life is by looking into the eyes of the other, whether it be a non-human animal, a person of a different skin color, a different language, a different culture, and they see themselves in those eyes. You have to see yourself in the eyes of the other. You see that you and I are the same. We are the same at an essential level. There's the epigram to the Animals in the Moral Community book was a statement that Schopenhauer made. I'll just read to you. He says, this is Schopenhauer from the 19th century. In all essential respects, the animal is absolutely identical with us. The difference lies merely in the accident, which is the intellect, and not in the substance, which is the will. The world is not a piece of machinery, and animals are not articles manufactured for our use. And the way that Schopenhauer tries to fill that idea in is by saying, look, you can think in an abstract, rational way about animals, or you can relate to them through your embodiment, through the will. And to me, until people make that turn and really feel what is happening to non-human animals, they're just going to go buy free-range eggs and do whatever it is that they do, or eat a little less meat, or whatever. The problem here is there are no magic words for causing that soul conversion about animals any more than there are magic words for any kind of soul conversion. And that is really the problem that we have. So I think arguments are important because once we start to be open to a certain idea through our felt kinship, then we can start to think about what we're really talking about. But I think that reason and emotion need to work dialectically or reciprocally in this process. And to me, it's only when we restore the emotional or affective dimension of moral judgment to the picture that we really open up things to including animals in the moral community. So I have a feeling that Professor Francione's approach is a little different, and I should acknowledge that he is a very accomplished activist, so he's going to probably have much more sort of tangible thoughts for you. Gary?
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, I think the animal movement is a disaster, a complete, utter, unequivocal disaster. I think that it does more harm than good for animals. I think that if you removed right now all of the animal organizations from the face of the earth, you would have a better chance of helping animals than having all of them continue to do their relentless fundraising and promote their nonsensical positions. The reason why Peter Singer is, although he is a utilitarian who rejects rights, the reason why Peter is considered the father of the animal rights movement is because he's basically created the modern movement, which takes the position that anything that reduces suffering is something we ought to pursue. Well, it doesn't require, it's not rocket science to say that you can couch anything as reducing suffering, and therefore these are things that ought to be pursued, and these are things that ought to be funded by people. But what we have right now, we don't really have an animal rights movement. We had an animal rights movement, if we did it all, for a brief period of time, going back to a time when most of you probably weren't even born yet. But it was gone fairly early. We don't talk about use, we talk about treatment. And what we talk about is humane treatment. Animals are property. it costs money to protect their interests. As long as they have the status of property, that level of protection is always going to be low because we have to purchase protection. We only purchase protection if it's economically a sensible thing to do, which means that for the most part, the level of protection we give to animals is the level of protection that we need to give them in order to exploit them in an economically efficient manner. What I mean by that is if we don't give them the minimal protection, then we're actually diminishing their value as property. So, for example, in many countries, there are laws that require that an animal be stunned before the animal shackled, hoisted, and cut. The reason for that is if you have a cow hanging upside down and she's moving around a lot, she hits workers and she causes injuries to the workers. That's an economic problem. And she also incurs carcass damage. That's an economic problem. That's also the reason, by the way, that chickens aren't covered by these laws, because they're small and because they don't have the same sorts, or at least we don't think that they have the same sorts of economic hits if we don't bring them under these humane slaughter laws. So the bottom line is animal welfare is always going to be low, and it's always going to be tied to that level of protection that we need to accord animals in order for animals to be able to be exploited, for us to exploit them in an economically efficient way. So animal welfare is useless. It's worthless. It doesn't do anything to help animals. Animal welfare consists of the rules that a rational property owner would follow in the absence of any law. So in other words, it's like animal welfare laws are like an instruction book that we give to owners of animals, and we say, this is how you should use your animals in an efficient way. So I think, and to have these animal organizations promoting these things and reinforcing the idea that there's a compassionate way to exploit animals, which is what these groups all do, all of them. There is not one animal organization that I'm familiar with, not one large animal organization that I'm familiar with anywhere in the world that basically promotes the idea that we cannot justify using them. We can't eat them. We can't wear them. We can't use them. We can't use them for entertainment. End of story. Can't use them. And we should end domestication. We have no business domesticating animals. We have no business bringing, what is domestication? It is creating animals whom we value for their submissiveness and for the fact that we can do with them what we want. Domestication is wrong. So we don't talk about that. We talk about treatment. And that's the problem. The problem is that's what activism is. But activism is it's a business. These animal organizations are all trying to keep their donor bases as broad as possible. And they're trying to sort of appeal to the most number of people. And so you appeal to the most number of people by saying, oh, okay, well, you eat meat and okay, fine, you can continue. You're not a bad person. We're not going to make a value judgment about your behavior. Continue to eat the meat and dairy, but just buy higher welfare meat and dairy. And, you're a vegetarian. Oh, well, that's fine. You don't have to be a vegan, even though there's no morally coherent distinction between eggs and dairy and all these other animal products. There's no morally coherent distinction, but that's okay. You can be a vegetarian. And so when we've got all of these crazy things like Meat-Free Monday and Veganuary, I mean, think about this for a second. If you take racism seriously, are you going to have racist-free Monday? Are you going to have sexist-free? Are you going to have rape-free Monday? Let's have rape-free Monday, And yes, of course you're not. That doesn't make any sense. So if animals matter, I'm not, and the issue of equality came up before. I have a book coming out next month called Why Veganism Matters, the Moral Value of Animals. And I basically argue, and it's a book addressed to people who care about animals. And what I argue in this is that if you care about animals and you're not vegan, you're not thinking clearly. That's it. And let me help you to see how, if you care about animals, veganism is not an option. It's a moral imperative. It's something you've got to do. And so I'm not saying that animals have all of the same rights as humans. That's nonsensical. I am saying that if you are sentient, then that's all you need to have the right not to be property. But if you've got that one right, that one little right, it's actually quite big because it means we can no longer justify the institutionalized exploitation of animals. We have to abolish and not regulate it. So I mean, I think the problem with the movement, and I don't know who asked that question because I couldn't see the box lighting up when the person was talking, but I've never used WebEx before. But I think the problem with the movement is based on this. It's a business. It's a business. It's not a philosophical social movement. It's a business, and it wants to keep the donor pool broad. So it does that by making sure that, you know, we don't make any moral judgments about animal exploitation. In my judgment, a movement that does an animal movement that does not make a moral judgment about animal exploitation is a worthless movement. So my answer is different from Gary's, although I agree with a lot of what he says in terms of you can't, if somebody doesn't care about animals, you can't, you know, I mean, it's the same thing if somebody doesn't care about women, you can't talk. I mean, if somebody really thinks that women are on earth to, you know, to provide sexual services for men, you can't really sort of you can't really get that person to sort of understand feminism. In the same way that, you know, if people really do believe that people of color, you know, are inferior people, if they really believe that, well, you know, you can't use logic to sort of say, well, you know, you can't really convince them of that. Same thing with animals. You know, if somebody really believes that animals are things and we can't have moral obligations, there's not a hell of a lot you can do. But where I think we've made a huge mistake is there's a zillion people out there who do care about animals. Many, many, many people. And what the movement has done, it's told those people, you don't have to be vegan. You don't have to be vegan as long as you're compassionate in your exploitation. And the answer is there is no such thing as compassionate exploitation. If you love animals and you continue to eat them, wear them, or use them, then you need to rethink what you believe about love.
For that, do you think that freeing ourselves of these large animal rights, so-called animal rights organizations that dilute the message, and returning back to the grassroots who have a more radical stance would be the solution?
Well, it depends on whether the I mean, you know, when I started off in the early 1980s, when I was involved with an American group called PETA, when there were about 10 of us, and you know, at that time, you know, one of the things that I did was I worked with the various PETA chapters, which were then closed because PETA became a centralized company. But in the beginning, there were groups of activists all over the country, and you know, I don't know. I mean, when you say the grassroots are more radical, I'm not 100% sure that that's true. I mean, I think we're, you know, another area in which we failed is that people who care about animals don't really sort of take the time to sort of think and learn about what it, you know, we're trying to undo thousands of years of anthropocentric thinking. How the hell are you going to do that, you know, if you don't educate yourself before you try to go out and educate other people? The number of times I have encountered animal people who say to me when I say, well, you know, Peter Singer doesn't believe in animal rights. He says that, you know, it's all right to use them as replaceable resources as long as they don't have a sense of the future. And people look at me and say, wait a minute, does he really say that? And I say, well, yeah. Where does he say that? He says that in Animal Liberation. Well, I've got Animal Liberation. Yeah, a lot of animal people have the books on their shelves. They don't bother to read them. And so I think it is important for us to try to, so we need to educate ourselves. The one thing I can tell you is that the presence of these organizations is really counterproductive, because I spend much of my time, I mean, I lecture all over the place on this issue, and I spend much of my time trying to undo the confusions that have been created by these organizations that say, well, if you eat cage-free eggs, if you eat crate-free pork, if you cut down, if you're a reducitarian, or if you're a flexible vegan, or all that sort of nonsense, all of this stuff comes from these groups. So, you know, you have to spend your time trying to sort of explain to people why the groups, you know, why the propaganda, the pro-exploitation propaganda coming out of the groups is problematic. And, you know, so that's what I think the problem is. But I'm coming, I think, when are they coming, Evangelist? They're coming in January?
Thank you.
Come again?
I say you've got me coming in January, February, March?
Yeah. This is for everybody. I think next to this invited lecture series, we'll have a series consisting of roundtables, opposing views, and very interesting discussions will be held. Yeah, Gary Francione, I mean, because we have two Garys here. Right after Christmas, after the turn of the year, you'll be invited as well, and we'll have the chance to say many more at the time. And of course, Gary Steiner will be there as well if he wants to, and intervene, and we'll have the opportunity to have this great debate once again. Please, who else would like to ask something? If you don't, I will. So please do ask something.
There is a question in the chat.
Vicky, could you please read it for everybody?
Yes, just a moment, please. Irini Fragiadaki asks, what role do ethics scientists play in the development of regulations and legislation on animal protection in the USA? I'm not sure if you heard me. Did you hear me?
Yes, I heard you.
Okay.
So this is a good question. I want to defer mostly to Professor Francione because this is really in his wheelhouse. One thing I simply want to point out is the obvious, which is that when you have animal agriculture so commercial and industrialized, what you have is scientists in many cases not being independent, but being funded by businesses that want certain types of outcomes in the research. And that prejudices a lot of that research in advance because it really plays to the economic interests of people in the animal agriculture industry. That's just a very broad picture. I think Professor Francione can probably drill very far into this. Gary, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, what role does ethics play in the United States in terms of regulation or legislation? The answer is zero, nothing. I mean, you know, it's completely, it's driven by economics. I mean, animal agriculture is an enormous business. I mean, it's probably second only to, say, the petroleum industry and perhaps the pharmaceutical, although I suspect animal agriculture is actually bigger than the pharmaceutical industry. It's enormous. So, you know, I mean, the decisions are based on economics. This is the problem with animal welfare. Because animals are property, they're part of this economic. You cannot underestimate the economic impact of this and the economic meaning of this, that animals are chattel property. You know, I have 5 dogs in this room right now. Well, actually, not all 5 of them are here, but we have 5 rescued dogs. From what I can see, 3 of them are here. I love them. I regard them as members of my family. They shouldn't exist. We shouldn't be breeding animals for human companion. They're all stray animals, abused animals that we took in. They're my property. Understand something. I love them. They're members of my family. But if I want right now, if I say, you know what, it's a pain in the ass to have dogs because it ties me to the house and I can't travel as much as I want to, blah, 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 blah. I could kill them all right now because they are my property. Or I could take them to a shelter and say, hey, find them another home. And if you don't, kill them. Because that's what you have to sign. You have to sign a waiver when you take them to the shelter. And so, you know, you can't underestimate the property problem and the domestication problem. I mean, this is an issue that I sort of stand alone in the movement because most people think that, you know, are not willing, even if they believe it, are not willing to say that domestication is wrong and domestication should stop. There is no doubt, and that's where I depart from, say, Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson in Zoopolis, where they talk about, you know, they basically take issue with my views about domestication. I cannot see how we can continue to justify domestication in deliberately bringing into existence animals that we use for our purposes. I do not see how we can do it. I've never heard a good argument in favor of it, and it seems to, and I've never heard a good refutation of the argument that I'm making about domestication. And so, you know, This is the problem. You cannot underestimate the property effect. Therefore, when people do legislation and regulation, it's always within that framework, and it always reflects those property values, those economic interests. And it doesn't matter whether, some people say, well, it's capitalism. It doesn't matter. Animal exploitation has existed in every single socioeconomic system we're familiar with, whether it's capitalist, whether it's democratic socialist, whether it's communist, it doesn't matter. There's animal exploitation in Cuba. There was animal exploitation in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was actually very, very prominent in the development of intensive agriculture methods. So it's not just a problem of capitalism. It's not just a problem of capitalism. The property status is tremendously determinative of all of the legislation, all of the regulations reflect. They're about property ownership. They're about the regulation of property ownership.
Thank you, professors. We have one more question in the chat. Mr. Nikos Glachakis asks whether there's a very heated debate between animal rights and animal welfare among our graduate students. And he asks if fully accepting animal rights imposes a burden on other parties. For example, restrictions in medical experiments will eventually lead to the death of human beings. Where exactly do we draw the line regarding animal rights, if we do at all?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an important question. It's an extremely obscure and difficult question to answer. And I really think I have to go back to the Bernhard Taurek idea that we have so dominated animals, not just physically, but conceptually. We have so projected a comprehensive grid of what we consider to be knowledge about nature onto the world around us. But the only way we'll ever know where to draw the line regarding animal rights is through a kind of experiment, through actually going down that road. My own view, and I think Professor Francione might well disagree with me on this, my own view based on the book that I'm nearing the completion of is that reason is not the way that Kant and Aristotle thought of it. Nous is not internal in the sense of, that sort of Parmenidean, Eleatic conception of reason as something absolute and outside of the human mind. I think that reason is something that emerges through our natural embodied experience. And I have really come to reject the Eleatic or Parmenidean notion of rationality as completely autonomous, or as nous as autonomous, and have really moved much more toward the notion of historical reason that is developed in the 20th century by thinkers such as George Santayana and Ortega y Gasset. And Ortega has a wonderful text from the 1940s entitled Historical Reason that really picks up some of the pragmatist themes of William James and Peirce, who try to show that reason is something that gains a better and better sense of itself through its unfolding in history. So that where we draw the line regarding animal rights is something we cannot possibly be in a position to know in the abstract. We must actually engage in the process of beginning to confer animal rights, engage in debates with ourselves and others, and we have to find a kind of equilibrium about animal rights that, again, I have come to become convinced is not something that we can prescribe in advance in an Eleatic fashion. I think what we have to do is actually use an experimental process of actual reasoning, valuing, decision-making, acting, and we have to see where that takes us before we can know where we need to draw the line. And we may never know. That may be what Kant called a regulative ideal, the idea of that dividing line. And it may be something that we're constantly revising as we learn new things, as we reflect more on our history, and as unanticipated contingencies confront us.
I would just say this, we'll talk more about this in January, but I don't even think you need the concept of animal rights to get rid of 99% of our animal use. I mean, the fundamental principle of even the welfarist view is that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering. Well, what does necessary mean? It means you can't justify the use of, you can't justify suffering that is imposed for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. It's got to mean any notion that unnecessary suffering is wrong. It's got to include at least that. The thing is that 99% of our animal use can't be described as necessary. As a matter of fact, our most significant use of animals is for food. We're killing between 70 to 80 billion land animals and at least 1 trillion sea animals every year for food. The best justification we have for that is that they taste good. That's not a very compelling reason. Okay, as a matter of fact, it's not a compelling reason at all. As a matter of fact, it's not a good reason at all, let alone a and so if we all took seriously the welfarist notion that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering, then the use of animals in biomedical research would probably be the only use of animals we would be talking about. And that would be the only difference between the welfarist and the rightist. Now, I object to the use of animals in experiments. I would not use any animals in experiments because I believe in animal rights. And my view is that we don't use humans. It would be much better if we use humans in experiments. We don't because we think that is wrong to treat humans, even humans who are mentally impaired, even humans who have all sorts of disabilities, etc. We think that's wrong. As a matter of fact, some of us think we have higher obligations to the humans who are vulnerable and who are disabled. And so I think that we need to be talking about right in that context. But the argument that I make that we cannot justify animal exploitation, you don't even need a rights basis, a rights theory, to see that is true with respect to 99% of our uses of animals. But we can talk more about that.
Professor Francione just drew my attention to something in the question in the chat that I think is very important, and I think he touched upon something very important here. In the chat, the question asks about whether what happens if restrictions in medical experiments would eventually lead to the death of human beings. And I think one of the last things that Professor Francione said reminds us that, look, if the criterion for making a judgment is what doesn't inconvenience human beings, then we got a problem. We're still in the anthropocentric worldview. In other words, if we take the position that, well, it's okay, and this is not Professor Francione's view, I'm not attributing this to him, but if we take the view that medical experimentation could be justified in cases of severe human need, we're still privileging human lives over non-human animal lives, and saying that humans' lives count more. And I think that what Professor Francione was getting at in the last part of what he said was, if you really, really believe in animal rights, you can't privilege human lives over non-human animal lives. And I would add, and I think Professor Francione would probably agree, except with the possible exception of the very, very unlikely eventuality where you have a face-to-face life or death confrontation with another being, and you might elect to save your own life, something like that.
I would say this also. If we all stopped eating animals and we didn't have animal exploitation, we'd have much less need to do research, because most of the diseases we get are diseases that we get from the consumption of animal products. And so that's another thing. There's somebody in chat said, do I feel that the right to property goes far enough? What about the rights of free living animals not to be displaced? What I argue is that the new book that's coming out is that veganism is the least that we can do. That if animals matter more, we may have to do more, but we cannot discharge, being vegan is necessary for us to respect the moral value of animals. It may not be sufficient. We might have to do more. What I get a little concerned about is the argument that we. There's a noise in the background which I'm not generating, so I don't know how where that's happening. But I get concerned when people start talking about interfering with animals and interfering with the non-domesticated world, because human beings have a really horrible track record of screwing things up when they try to intervene in the world, in the quote natural world, whatever that means. But so I think we have to be careful about that. But yeah, I mean, I think displacing animals is something we need to be concerned about. I think that but I also believe that if we lived in a vegan world, if none of us were using them for food, for clothing, for entertainment, and for all of these things, I think we're never going to be able to avoid all harm to animals, because when we're planting crops, however careful we are, even if we don't use pesticides and things like that, some animals are going to be killed. But that's true with humans as well. As long as humans are engaged in activity, other humans will be injured, even unintentionally. So we can't avoid all harm to animals, but we can avoid all harm to animals that comes from using them exclusively as resources. Just like we can't avoid all harm to humans, but we can avoid all harm to them that comes from using them as chattel slaves or otherwise exclusively as means to our ends. So, we live in a world in which our actions have consequences. We will never get rid of harm for humans or for non-humans. But we can abolish all harm that comes as a result of using animals as exclusively as resources, in the same way that we can abolish all harm that comes from using human beings exclusively as resources. What else we have to do is, that's a different discussion. I'm talking about the bare minimum, and I'd be happy to see the bare minimum done in my lifetime, and then I'll worry about you younger people will worry about what else we got to do in the future. But it seems to me that while we're all consuming them, while we're all eating them and wearing them and using them for other purposes and whatnot, we are never going to make there's never going to be any change. As long as we're shoveling them into our mouths, whatever else we're saying is nonsense.
I see a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to answer. Is that okay, Evangelos? So one of them has to do with whether
please answer them.
Oh, thank you, Vicky. One of the questions in the chat has to do with whether the kind of language that we employ can reinforce or dismantle anthropocentric tendencies. And this might strike you as trivial or insignificant, but I think that the words that we use are extremely important. And the one way to think about this is think about the fact that every culture has different words for the same thing. And some of them are acceptable in polite society, and some of them are not. You only use them at the bar, at the tavern, or you only use them with members of your own sex or something like that, or you only use it in the high school locker room. I have a good friend, an English professor at Bucknell, who spent part of his growing up years in Greece, and he taught me some Greek, but the problem is he only taught me the bad words. These are words that I could never say right now. Now, what difference does it really make what this little word signifies if it's just a word? Well, it means a huge difference. There are certain things you don't say in certain circumstances, and we all know this. I believe that the same thing holds for the discourse about non-human animals. So much so that what I'm doing in the book that I'm completing right now, and I'm anticipating possible difficulties with the publisher, is I used to talk about humans and animals. And you'll find in the very early pages of each of my books a footnote that says, When I refer to humans and animals, this is just a shorthand. I recognize that human beings are animals. I'm really talking about human animals versus non-human animals, and I'm just making the human versus animal distinction for economy. Well, what I say in the beginning of this new book that I'm writing is I used to do that, but I'm worried that it reinforces the sense that human beings are not really animals after all, so that every time I refer in the entire book to animals, to non-human animals, I actually say non-human animals, not just animals. It's because I want to reinforce through that 300 pages of repetition that human beings are animals. And we admit it and we say, yes, of course, we're a biological species and so forth, but we very quickly try to cover that up and forget it by talking about animals as if we weren't them. And every time we talk about a non-human animal as an animal, you could put the word mere in front of it and say mere animal. And I think that language makes an enormous, enormous difference. There was also a question in the chat, and Professor Francione might have some interesting thoughts about this. I'll just give you a tentative thought. The question was, is there a way to use animals without exploiting them? And my thinking is, if there is, I'd be very interested to hear about it. That's my thought. Gary, you got anything you want to say?
No, I mean, I think domestication is a problem. As a matter of fact, before I come and talk with you, I'll send Evangelos some of my stuff that he could distribute to you about domestication, because I think that's controversial for a lot of people. No, I don't think we should be using them at all. I love my dogs. They shouldn't have existed in the first place. As much as I love my dogs, if there were 2 left on the planet and it were up to me whether we continue to breed them so that we could have pets, the answer would be no way. I think it's wrong. Got to take care of them. They're here and they're here not as a result of anything they did, but as a result of our ignorance and our moral, our failure to think critically in a moral way. But I don't think we should be having any more of them. And no, I don't think we should be using them at all. I don't buy into this stuff, the political, the philosophy that goes by the expression the political turn, that we can integrate animals into our political system. The answer is, what are you talking about? I don't even understand. I mean, I think that is just nonsense. So what that means is it's again, it's sort of a benign, or arguably more benign form of exploitation. But anyway,
yeah, I'll add something to that, Gary.
I've got to run because I got another presentation in a half an hour, and so I've got another thing I've got to do, and so I'm going to take off now. Thank you all, Gary. It's been great seeing you again. Evangelos, terrific. Thank you for inviting me. Peace, everybody, and I will see you next. Evangelos, tell me when you want me to do it.
After the turning of the year, within January, in any case.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Take care. Okay. Be well, everybody. Be well.
Take care and stay safe.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Is there a moment for me to add a remark about Kymlicka and Zoopolis? Are some of you familiar with the text Zoopolis? It was published about 10 years ago by a Canadian philosopher named Will Kymlicka. And I think Evangelos can give you his information. And Zoopolis is using political theory, democratic political theory, to classify different types of non-human animals, so that the animals that live in your country are treated as a kind of citizen, dependent citizens, citizens who can't speak for themselves, who need representation. And then he's got what he calls liminal or boundary animals, and those are beings, like I said, like geese who are passing through or something like that. And then there are completely foreign animals. And in the 10 years since it was published, Zoopolis has gained a tremendous amount of attention, possibly more attention than any single book written about animal ethics. And what Donaldson and Kymlicka argue is that the type of animal rights abolitionist theory that Gary Francione represents involves a complete separation of humans and non-human animals, complete apartheid between human beings and non-human animals. And Professor Francione, if he were here, would dispute that, he would challenge that claim. But the thing that I think Professor Francione and I both find problematic about the zoopolis model is this: we're using human-conceived, human-devised ideas of political community, and we're imposing them on non-human animals. And I've had many discussions with Professor Kimlicka in Canada about this. He just gave a talk last week in which I asked him the question again: what if we find ourselves in relationship with animals who don't really care about our democratic ideas and don't want to live according to our democratic principles and expectations? What happens then? And he doesn't really have an answer for that. That's where I think the zoopolis model is still anthropocentric. It's a very interesting idea, and it's attractive because it has an answer for everything. Right? How do you treat squirrels? How do you treat your pet dog? How do you treat the geese flying from Canada? What do you do about the butterflies going to Mexico? But it assumes that human measures of right and wrong are legitimate for everybody. And that's where I have a certain kind of misgiving. Oh, somebody put in, Vicky, thank you. Vicky put into the chat a link to the Zoopolis book. I'll add just one thing. Even though I disagree with books like Zoopolis, I found it extremely interesting and thought-provoking to read. And my advice, not that you're asking, but my advice is you're better off reading thinkers you disagree with than reading thinkers you agree with. Because you don't need anybody to pat you on the back and tell you that you're right. What you need is somebody to challenge your judgment. And that's what I experience when I read something like Zoopolis. Here's another question. I'm sorry if I'm skipping some of these in the chat. I'm just sort of whatever shows up I'm looking at. What do you think about other animals or our fellow animals versus non-human animals? It's an interesting possibility. I want to show you something that was recently published. A Harvard professor named Christine Korsgaard, you may know her. She's a Kant scholar. She wrote this book, Fellow Creatures, in 2018. Fellow Creatures are obligations to the other animals. So to the questioner, I'm not sure if you're referring to Korsgaard's expression, but I think that's a good one too. I think I was using non-human because I wanted to be very, very specific in my reference for English readers. So there was no confusion about because other animals, depending upon the context, potentially ambiguous, but I don't have any problem with our fellow animals. I like that one. That's a good one. Maybe I will steal that from you. Oh, it was inspired by Korsgaard. There you go. Oh, by the way, the Korsgaard book is extremely good. Again, a book I disagree with, but she does a great job of trying to defend, or not defend Kant, but revise or rehabilitate his ideas. And I would say it's a must-read for anybody who's really interested in animal rights. Oxford University Press, Christine Korsgaard, Fellow Creatures.
Yeah, just to clarify, if I can, that's exactly the inspiration behind our fellow animals. Yeah, because just to expand a little bit, I use non-human animals for more than a year. I just find it a bit clunky, and members of the public,
isn't it?
It's
right,
yeah. I just
Jeremy.
found, and members of the public are kind of like, wait, what did you say? And it kind of centers humans. So I just find other animals most universal, but then our fellow animals, inspired by our fellow creatures, is, yeah, I found it works well.
It's an interesting thought, and I've got to think about this because I'm not at publication yet, so I can do whatever I want. And I don't like non-human animals. Does sound clinical, so thank you, Jeremy. By the way, where are you right now?
I'm based in the UK. I have the American accent might throw you though. But yeah, I'm in Brighton in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
you.
you.
Really enjoying this. So thank you, everyone.
May I ask something, Gary?
Yes, Evangelos.
There's something that crossed my mind during your conversation with Gary Francione. Do you think that anthropocentric views and theories are totally hopeless? I mean, Gary Francione confessed twice that he keeps dogs as pets, but he thinks that keeping dogs as pets or animals in general is not morally justified. I mean, if we refocused from what animals actually are and what we owe to them, to what we are and what makes us better human beings, or what, let's say, facilitates a more meaningful life. I mean, the Aristotelian view. Would it be totally hopeless? I mean, keeping pets may be morally unjustified in terms of rights or duties or etc., but it doesn't make a person a bad person, isn't it? I don't know if I was clear enough for folks.
Well, let me say a few things and tell me if this is what you're getting at, because again, your questions are always very, very rich, and there are many aspects to them, and so I'm going to pick up on one facet, one aspect. I don't know if anthropocentric approaches are hopeless, and the reason I say that is because if you compare the type of non-anthropocentric worldview that I have been developing, and I started really to do it in this book, Animals in the Moral Community. There are a lot of features or conceptual tools in the non-anthropocentric outlook that come from the anthropocentric tradition. Much of the vocabulary is from the anthropocentric tradition, so that it's not like it's not as if we move from one to the other and there's no connection between them at all. I really see the non-anthropocentric as a kind of evolution of historical reason as it works through the limitations that I believe we have encountered of the anthropocentric worldview. For me, what's probably ultimately more important than the question anthropocentric versus non-anthropocentric worldview or background ideal of living is that question about felt kinship, that it can't just be rational arguments. So I'll offer a gentle and respectful criticism of Professor Francione. When one person asked much earlier today about the question, it was something about activism and whether we are alienating people. I said that it's not just arguments that change people. It's really a change of heart, a change of feeling. And however we bring that about, I think as soon as that happens in a person, that's what catapults them from an anthropocentric standpoint to a non-anthropocentric one. However, we've all seen people who make that conversion temporarily and then they revert back. I don't think that there's any guarantee that once a person makes that turn or has that insight, that it will stay with them. Because I've known people who very briefly were terrified by what they saw, horrified by what they saw about animal exploitation. And they became vegan for a month or a year, but then they went back. So I think it's very, very mysterious what keeps people, engaged with this insight or this feeling about animals. I just happen to think that in all likelihood, arguments alone won't convince people. I've had enough very famous philosophers, names come to my university over the years and give talks. And there's always a dinner before they give their talk. And I'm talking about political philosophers and moral philosophers, not talking about animal rights. And you get into a conversation at the dinner table and they find out that I work on animal rights. They've got every excuse in the book, every possible excuse for why we don't need to abandon an anthropocentric worldview. One very, very famous political philosopher about 10 years ago, she was saying, why is it that we need to abandon an anthropocentric worldview? We can just take care of animals through welfare measures. And I said, but look at all these horrible things that we do, de-beaking the chickens, or killing the male chicks without anesthesia, or all these horrible things that they do to stun and kill, and maybe they're cutting the throat when the animal's not dead yet, and things like that. And every time I said something like this philosopher's answer is, well, we don't have to do that. But the obvious answer to that is, but that's precisely what we do. So saying that in some abstract fantasy land we don't have to exploit animals in order to use them profitably, it just doesn't have any relation to the reality in which we live. So for me, I don't know that an anthropocentric worldview is it can't work. What I do know is that the one thing that's got to happen is people have to feel. They have to feel their connection with the rest of the non-human world, or our fellow creatures, as Jeremy put it. That's what has to happen. Now, Evangelos, I don't know if I answered your question.
I think that the issue is huge, and we could continue discussing it for hours. But yeah, I'm covered for now. Yeah, maybe we have to discuss about these two different lines of life reasoning in the future. I mean, by this I mean to commit you to one more, or at least one more lecture to the students and the staff. Okay.
I'm happy to do that. Thank you. Can I answer one last question maybe before we conclude? It's the last one in the chat. The question is, do you think veganism is an important matter on animal ethics? And if we recognize rights to animals, do we have to stop eating them? There are a lot of questions about animal rights, which exact rights animals get. The question from a short while ago, the great question, where do we draw the line? It's a scary question. But we don't need to know where to draw the line in order to know that the vast majority of people do not need to eat animals in order to be healthy and live well. So for me, at least for the vast majority of human beings, namely for any human being on the face of the planet whose life does not depend crucially and directly on the consumption of animals, and there are apparently people who are that way, who have to consume some animal products in order to live. If you're not one of them, you shouldn't consume animal products at all. And I mean food, meat, dairy, eggs, wool, silk, leather. I'm opposed to animal experimentation. I think veganism is a moral imperative. I call it the vegan imperative in my last book, Animals and the Limits of Postmodernism. And I think the vegan imperative is incumbent on anybody whose life does not immediately, directly, and crucially depend upon the consumption of animal products. And as I've often said in public talks, I'm going to guess that nobody in this call, I may be wrong, if I'm wrong, I apologize, but I'm going to guess, I'm going to bet $1 that nobody on this call is in that position where they must eat animals in order to survive.
I think this is it. Vicky, what do you say?
May I ask a question, please? A final question.
Yes.
Referring to what you were saying before, I think that what you were essentially saying is that people need to cultivate empathy in order to feel a certain way about animals. So do you have any suggestions as to how empathy can be cultivated successfully in people? Because not all people are born with it. Some have it in higher amounts than others. So I think that, you know, for me, this is the most important thing when it comes to treating animals.
Yeah, empathy and a sense of compassion, absolutely. I am at a complete loss, Vicky. I don't know how you cultivate that in people. I do know that it is possible for people to set an example for others. And sometimes, you know, we all have people in our lives we remember as role models, as examples of how we want to live our lives. They exhibit virtues that we value, that we esteem. And for me, I don't think there are any guarantees. The vast majority of my long time friends I've known since childhood, are not vegetarian or vegan. I don't know how you change people's attitudes about those things. I think the best thing that we can do, and the one thing that we have in our power, is to live the kind of life that we want other people to live. In spite of the challenges and the difficulties and the occasional ridicule, which some of us receive for this. I think Professor Francione sets a very good example for this, because he's absolutely determined to deliver his message, and he doesn't care whether people dislike it. And he sometimes has to get somewhat aggressive about delivering his message. And I understand that. Different people will respond in different ways. I think that some people respond to Professor Francione's approach. I have a slightly different approach. I hope that some people respond to my approach. But it's just like John Stuart Mill said, you have to have lots of different kinds of people interacting with each other. And that's how you get creative solutions to things. But how you cultivate empathy in other people, or in people, I almost want to cry, because when I look at the world and I see how much selfishness and exploitation and carelessness there is, a lack of caring, it just makes me so sad. And so I don't have a good answer to it. I wish I did. But you're right. That's the issue. How do you cultivate empathy in others?
Thank you. It makes me very sad as well.
Guys, everything nice must come to an end, isn't it? Gary, we haven't seen each other since 2013.
It's wonderful to see you again.
Yeah. It was a huge cosmic conspiracy that led us to that point. I mean, pandemics, etc. But it's very, very nice to see you again. And really, there are no words to thank you for being with us today. And please commit that this is not the first, the last time. It's just the first from a series of times.
Look, I very much appreciate the opportunity to share my ideas, particularly with such a receptive audience, because especially in the United States, sometimes, like I said, philosophy can be like a fist fight. And I very much appreciate the kinds of questions and thoughts and suggestions. And Jeremy, I'm going to take that suggestion home with me. I am home, so I'm not taking it anywhere, but I'm going to take it back to my writing with me. I think it's a really apt one. Thank you for it. And I'm happy to come back and give more talks. And especially, I'm hoping that once COVID passes and everything's under control, that I'll be able to make another trip to Greece and see you all in person. I would love nothing more than that. And so I want to say once again, Professor Proto-Papadakis and Ms. Proto-Papadaki, thank you so much for the invitation and the arrangements. It's been a delight to do this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was your speech was delightful.
Thank you.